History lecture. This is part 6 of 7 in our series of American history. So thanks for joining me today. It's been quite a morning, actually. For those who may or may not know, we've had a lot of protests right now in America. You probably heard about it or saw it on the news or on the internet. We've had a series of protests and honestly violence and some looting due to the death of a Black man named George Floyd. He was killed by a white police officer a little over a week ago, May 25th, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And his death was caught on film, and it sparked a lot of outrage and it sparked a lot of protests. So if you're wondering what's happening, it's because of the death of a Black man that we're protesting. And he's not just one Black man in the sense that he is part of a very long history in America of innocent Black men getting killed by the hands of police. It's not even necessarily white police officers. It's just police officers sometimes acting brutally or savagely against Black men and women. So I just have to point that out, that we are beginning this lecture on that sad note. And it's very interesting too about this lecture because we're going to be talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in America, which throughout the entire 4 decades, we had protests. So it's very weird to be thinking about this when this happened about 50 years ago in America, these protests, this outrage against racism in our country. So it's very interesting that this lecture is timed during this time. But I want to begin. This is my painting. You could say my picture for a lecture. It's, as you notice, it's by a similar artist that I showed in my first lecture, Jasper Johns. It's called Map, and it's a map of the United States. And it's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he painted in 1961. So it's right during our period that we're going to be talking about. And I really like it, actually, in part because it's messy. It's not a very clean image. It's got a lot of, paint marks and almost looks like stains or something. And the borders, you can kind of make them out, but, paint colors are going across borders. And what I really like about it is that, you get different colors intermixed. So you start to see how America is becoming more blended into Canada and into Mexico and even into the oceans. So I think it kind of symbolizes, at least to me, how America is no longer really becoming its own self in the sense that it's becoming part of the world for better and for good. So this is the decade in America where we have a lot of messiness, ugliness, a lot of colorful things happening in our country, especially after World War II. And so I like that. It shows this is a very messy time period, and this painting shows that. And it also shows how we no longer are isolationists. We're definitely merged or blended into the world. And this is the period of deep globalization, especially in the 80s in America. So I like it for those reasons. And if you have your own reasons, that's fine. Not a problem. I just think, I don't know, it was very symbolic to me when I saw it, and I always remembered it too. So to begin, let me go to my next slide. So let's just review a little bit of, it was actually lecture 5, key points. So last lecture was very long. I'm very sorry, guys. And I'm going to try to be concise. I'm trying for this lecture. So last lecture, we had the New Deal, which was when FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, tried to lift the economy up out of the Great Depression. He passed a lot of support for bankers, banks, farmers, and workers, to try to get everyone afloat. We're not really sure if that actually worked or not because, while he's doing the New Deal, while the Great Depression is occurring, we have Pearl Harbor, which happened on June 6th, not June 4th. June 6, 1941. I made that mistake. I'm sorry. So that happened, and we had to enter into the war. And at first, we didn't want to enter the war. Our typical history makes us go into neutrality or isolationism. But with World War II, FDR really sees that we got to enter, and he does that very slowly by supporting allies, by selling weapons and leasing weapons to them. But once Pearl Harbor happens, we enter into the war. There's no going back in some way. And it's also the start of the Cold War, as you know. It's the beginning of the American and USSR relationship of being cold. It's not quite a war, but it's not a war. It's like we're always prepared for a war, especially a nuclear war. And this Cold War, it's in some ways you could say the longest war in America. It happened for 45 years, and it's very strange to think about that, but it was definitely, if not a military war, it was a cultural war. And then, of course, after the post war period or after World War II, we have a post war period of the civil rights movement. And I started to touch upon that. And we have that movement because so many Black Americans coming from World War II were disgusted that they were treated as second class citizens in the military and in life, but also that they fought against tyranny abroad, but they have tyranny at home. And to be quite frank, that's what probably many of the protesters right now are still protesting, the tyranny of the police at times against Black men and women. Um, the police isn't always brutal in America, but there are these moments, that just reminds you of how we still live in a very racist society, at least in America, we do. So, but this movement, this civil rights movement, is really, I think, it's what sparks the entire revolutionary mentality and movement in America. The civil rights movement affects other groups of people, not just Black Americans. And that's why I think we do revere so many civil rights leaders, in part because of what they stood for. And they always knew that when you fight for Black Americans, you always also fight for women in America, disabled people in America, LGBTQ in America, and Native Americans. It's always a ripple effect, we say. So, just to backtrack a little bit, I did touch upon Truman last lecture, but I wanted to give you a little bit more information. And this is also the period in America where I have to focus on each president. I can't skip 3 or 4. Ever since the World War II, every president in America has been very influential that you can't skip them over. I also thought I'd give you some information about them, a little bit of fun facts, and also what we call them. So this is Harry S. Truman. We call him Truman for short. Usually, we don't say Harry S. Truman. And those are the year of his presidency, 1945 to 1953. And just so you know, Harry S. Truman, he has no middle name, but he put an S because in America you have to have a middle name. It's kind of weird to not have one. I don't know why actually, but so he has no middle name, but he went by Harry S. Truman. He was born in Lamar, Missouri in 1882, and he was a county judge before he was a U.S. senator. And I don't believe he ever got his college degree. He went through college, but he never fully received it due to, I think, personal circumstances and the war too. He was actually in World War I. So that had an influence on him. And he's really well known because he had to see America through World War II. FDR died during World War II, so Truman had to finish it, so to speak. And he chose to drop the atomic bombs. Where I don't really know why he did. It's a personal choice. But he really thought that by dropping the bombs, he would save more lives and then continue the war. And, it's easy for us to reflect, oh, he should have done that. He should have done this. But at the time, no one really knew the consequences of atomic bombs. We had tests on atomic bombs, but Truman didn't even know anything about the bombs till he entered office. So it kind of caught him off guard. Something to note, he did see after the end of World War II, he saw the signing of the United Nations Charter. And remember, United Nations is a very old project that was originally kind of manifested by President Wilson. So finally, President Wilson gets his dream. It's not the League of Nations, but it's the United Nations. And Truman continued with FDR's Social Security net, with what he called a fair deal. FDR had the square deal. The square deal. And Truman had the fair deal. And so he just continued what FDR started. He expanded Social Security. He passed Fair Employment Practices Act, and he built more public housing and cleared more slums. Slums being kind of areas in cities that are generally very poor. They're often crime-ridden. It's where people who make a very low wage go, or they live, so to speak. He starts to begin the Cold War, so to speak, from America's point of view, when he believes in the theory of containment. The containment policy being that we can't stop communism and where it is already, but we can try to stop it from growing. So that's why he gives $400 million to Turkey and Greece in 1947. And to an extent, he's successful because neither Turkey nor Greece are communist. Although I know Turkey has a very close relationship with the Soviet Union and even today with Russia. So, and then Greece also has its difficulties too, I know at times, especially in the 10 years ago with the EU and the IMF. So when I will say something else that Truman did when the USSR, the Soviet Union, blockaded Western sectors of Berlin, I think Stalin felt like he owned and controlled Berlin because Berlin was part of East Germany, which was part of the USSR. Truman was not going to back down, and he wasn't going to allow Stalin to impose his will, so to speak. So he and the British actually did a huge airlift campaign of giving lots of supplies to Berliners. And they continued to do this until the USSR backed down, didn't continue to impose. So that was successful. And that's part of also the Marshall Plan. Remember, the Marshall Plan was a plan by Secretary Marshall under Truman, who believed that to help Western Europe fight against communism and to ensure that a World War III didn't happen, Europe was going to receive a lot of money from America, a lot of aid from America. And Truman also, part of that deal was with NATO, the creation of NATO. He decided to create a military alliance with Western nations in response to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact too. And he created NATO in 1949. So this is still going on today, NATO. It's a very old organization. How effective it is, I don't know. That's more of a policy question. But it has still, I would say an influence, especially in Western Europe, maybe Eastern Europe more so. And then something that also should mention is he began the Korean War and even the Vietnam War. The very early remnants of the Vietnam War start with Truman. It's escalated under Kennedy and under Lyndon B. Johnson, but he's kind of the beginnings of it. He starts to give aid actually to the French to fight the communist faction in North Vietnam. So this is the start of when the US gets tangled in Vietnam. And he had two very famous quotes. I have to tell you them. I like them too. He had "the buck stops here." He had that quote on his desk. That's the actual sign that he had on his desk. And that just means the buck, meaning the US dollar. I don't know why it's called a buck actually, but it means the US dollar. And he meant to say that like the financial responsibility of the United States is on the president and it stops at his desk. Like he is responsible. So it was him trying to take, ownership and responsibility of like what happens in the country. The president has a role. And he had another great quote: "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." It's kind of this idea that, if you can't be in the fight, then get out, you don't be involved. And I'm not sure where the context of that quote came from. I should have looked that up. But it's just a very famous one, and people say it, just in general, when someone can't handle the fight or can't handle the conflict, then get out. So he's an interesting man. And I should mention about the Korean War. So it's a war that, at least in America, I'll be quite frank, maybe the world, it's not well remembered. We don't memorialize it in the same way that we memorialize the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. It's kind of forgotten, I think, in a very sad way, personally. And I think it's forgotten for not a very good reason, but for an understandable reason. It's one of the first wars that the U.S. doesn't have the U.S. isn't a clear winner. We didn't fail, so to speak, but we didn't win. So, in America, we always like to kind of look optimistically on our wars and say we were the winners, we were on the good side, we were the we fought evil, we were the good doers, do-gooders, so to speak. And the Korean War is one of the first of many wars, to be quite frank, that questions our mentality of, are we always the good guys in a war? But anyway, so during World War II, we had actually American troops in South Korea, because Japan was taking over Korea. So we wanted to try to stop their presence and stop their troops. And the Soviets placed their troops in north of Korea, in the northern part. And there's a division starting at the 38th parallel, which still exists today. And what happened was, after the war, the United Nations oversaw elections to finally figure out who's going to be the leader of Korea. But North Korea, led by Kim Il Sung, they would not participate in these elections. So even when the leader of South Korea was elected, or the leader of Korea, right, was elected, North Korea would not recognize it. And the trouble begins when the United States withdraws its forces from the peninsula. We do that because, the war is over. We think we need to get out. And, North Korea takes advantage of that. So they pull in their troops in 1950. They start to enter South Korea. And that's when the United States and the United Nations responds. And we send forces to fight the North Koreans. But this never ends up being a clear, decisive win. And I can go deeper into that, but I won't. But the effect is that there was never really a clear win or loss. There was just a truce, just a treaty, an agreement that, okay, we're going to have a North Korea and a South Korea, and they will be divided into the 38th parallel. And this is after 3 years of fighting. This happens. And there was a famous movie. This was actually hard to find a movie about Korea, because one of the reasons why we don't know a lot about it, I think, in America, is we never made a lot of films about it. The most famous TV show is MASH. But to be quite frank with MASH, if you watched it, you wouldn't always think it's in Korea or that it's about the Korean War. It's more of a comedy sketch series, take placing in an army hospital in Korea. But the famous one that I could think of was The Manchurian Candidate with Frank Sinatra. That came out in 1962. But I did want to show you this I think it's a very beautiful picture. It's the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. And to be honest, I don't think many people visited, even though it's in the heart of the, capital. And it's next to the Vietnam Memorial. It's next to the Lincoln Memorial. It's actually my favorite memorial in D.C. because this is just one photo of it. If you look very closely at the memorial, it's actually just it's statues of U.S. troops, and they have their backpacks on, they have their guns on, and what I find it so eerie but beautiful is how realistic it looks. It's not symbolic in many ways. It's not trying to put this grander meaning. It's literally showing how the troops probably looked and responded. And you can even see here, there's a soldier who looks terrified. And the thing about Korea too, we sent in a lot of Marines, but what was so difficult about the war for our Marines too was that it was very cold. I don't think people realized how cold Korea was during this war. They had to fight up towards the north. It was very cold. Korea gets cold in general, south and north. And so here they are with their backpacks, and this is actually the war memorial during the winter in DC. So I just think it's very realistic, and I kind of appreciate the memorial because it doesn't try to do something bigger or more symbolic, not that I'm against that, but sometimes I appreciate the realism of this memorial. So moving on, after the Korean War, after Truman, we have Ike, or Dwight D. Eisenhower, the famous general during World War II. He was famously known as Ike because Ike comes from his last name, Eisenhower, and it was kind of just like a pet name for him, I think. But it was a very famous presidential campaign slogan. People would wear a pin, the one on here, up above here. It said, "I like Ike," meaning they like Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it was part of his popularity was that he was a general. He led the forces in World War II, so people are going to probably vote for him. They see his leadership qualities. But Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was born in 1890, and notice that a lot of our presidents up until a certain point are born very early 1900s, and I think that has an effect in America. But he was born in 1890 in Texas, but he grew up in Kansas. So he grew up in kind of the Midwest America. He didn't grow up in a fancy household. And he went to West Point Academy, which is, oh, I'm sorry, this is a typo, guys. It says U.S. Army College. It's U.S. Army College. My bad. I read over my PowerPoints, but sometimes I still mess up. Sorry. So it's the U.S. Army College. I'll fix that actually. But it's a very prestigious academy. We have a naval academy and we have an army academy, but it's called West Point Academy. It's in West Point, New York. So, he went there and he grew up an army, soldier. It was his whole life. He commanded, of course, Allied forces in World War II. And interesting enough, I don't know why, but he was the president of Columbia University after the war for a brief moment. I don't know why, but I think that's interesting. But then he left Columbia to lead NATO. He became the commander of it, and he oversaw the Korean War truce, the end of the Korean War. And part of what makes this difficult is that China enters the war. And I think that's one of the reasons why we ended up giving a truce into the war. Once China started to supply and support North Korea, we knew that it was going to be a bigger war. It was going to, grow in mass. So we went out of it. And one of the things that he did was he tried to ease tensions with the USSR by agreeing to allow Soviet photographs of US lands, aerial photographs of I think it's our military installations. I'm not sure. And vice versa. The USSR allowed the US to fly over its lands and take photos of its military areas in its country, and also to see what weapons were being formed, kind of to check one another. And something that should be noted is during Ike's presidency, Stalin dies in 1953. And that's when we do kind of have a new Soviet leadership with Khrushchev, and things, I think, start to thaw a little bit. And he continued. So Eisenhower, I should say, was a modern Republican. He continued Truman's Fair Deal, but he didn't believe in expanding it. As a modern Republican, he still believed in a sense of conservatism, financially, militarily, morally. He believed that, America needed to conserve its principles. But he didn't want to get rid of the social programs that had been enacted because they did benefit many people and help many people. And something that should be noted, he actually started the large, massive interstate highway system in America. And that's a very big deal. It's the large highway that literally connects all of America. Like there's one called I-10 in New Orleans where I am, and it connects, I think, like, I don't even know how many states, but it runs through my city and runs through my state into Texas. It's a very monumental task, and it wasn't even completed until 1992. So it took a long time. Something that should be also noted, even though he was from the military, he was very concerned by the growth of the military's power. And also, not just its power, but its influence in Congress. He called it the military industrial complex. This deep relationship between military industries, capitalist industries, and also at times the government. And to be honest, we have that today. And he warned against it because when you're so intertwined, it's hard then to unwind when problems occur. And then you have military companies, like the big ones in America are Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, even Boeing. These are all large military companies in America. And a good example actually right now is Raytheon is a military company, and they create the weapons and I think the missiles that are used by Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen, Yemeni people. Right now, Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen and the people there, and it's at time doing it in a way that's very unjust, cruel. I would say personally, it breaks international laws. But what they found is that the missiles that the Saudi Arabians are using are missiles built by U.S. company Raytheon, and they were sold through the government, the Trump administration, and even during Obama actually, but Obama stopped it for a while. The Obama and Trump administration allowed for Raytheon to sell its weapons to Saudi Arabia, which has then been used against Yemen. So this is a good example of a military industrial complex where military companies are getting, close with the government to then make a profit. And this is what Eisenhower, who was a general, was very concerned about. And you really see this. I won't go into this lecture, but next lecture, during the Iraq and Afghan war. The military industries become very wealthy and very powerful during the war on terror. And to be quite frank, still are. Some of the wealthiest companies in America are military companies, but they employ a lot of people, they're very powerful. So anyway, I had to mention that. And as you remember last lecture, we had the civil rights movement. We had Little Rock Nine, where we had 9 Black students who tried to go to school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they were yelled at, they were screamed at. And one of those students, I wanted to show you this famous picture, was Elizabeth Eckford. This is actually a very famous photo during the civil rights movement. And here she is attending her first day of school and getting yelled at by a bunch of white people. I hate to say that. And he oversaw this. Eisenhower oversaw this. He had to send in troops to make sure that these students could attend school. So I always want to put in the background that, the US, along with all these other things we're dealing with, like the Cold War, China, growth industry, we also are still dealing with racism in America. And we still are today. So that's Eisenhower. And this was his very famous speech, his farewell speech, which he made in 1960. And that's when he talked about the military industrial complex. And it was one of the first, I believe, televised speeches from a president. And so I wanted to show that because this is the start of TV's vast growth in America. Every household in America, and I'm sure in Ukraine even, has a TV. Well, maybe not so much anymore because everybody is streaming everything on their phone. So I don't know, but TV is starting to rocket in America. It's starting to become part of every American household. So, and I wanted to just show you this little collage of the 1950s, kind of some images and kind of a summation of the decade to an extent. This is not everything. The 50s were called the happy days. There was kind of this post-war optimism and glow in America. You have, the growth of big industries like McDonald's. The very first McDonald's is opened up in 1955. This is actually a picture of it. But you also have like just kind of more fun and the start of like a freedom in terms of women, in terms of society. Here's a famous poodle skirt that woman wore during the 50s, which you might have noticed from the movie Grease. But these are the poodle skirts, and women wore them and they loved them. They got to spin around in them. They were just kind of like, I think they were popular in part because, well, they were still modest. They were below the knee, which, Americans didn't want scandal above the knee, but they got to be playful. You got to have designs on them. And they're called poodle skirts because originally they had a black poodle on them. I don't know why. But it's, kind of the movement of like, Americans are enjoying their freedom, so to speak, their post-war optimism, they're having fun. And part of that having fun is, we have the start of the TV and the TV shows. One of the most famous one was from I Love Lucy. She was a character, and her name was Lucille Ball, but she played a housewife who was basically kind of trying to always disturb her husband and his band. She wanted to be part of the band, but you see how she kind of made a mockery of herself, but also how she kind of made a mockery of being a housewife. which is interesting because back then in the 1950s in America, women were still very much relegated or placed into the home. And that's why you have such a big growth in um, appliances in households like the dishwasher, the refrigerator, the TV, a brand new living room, as I show here. There's huge um, push for women and men to, really outfit their homes because this was kind of seen as like the little heart of America was the home. And you had your husband and you had your wife and your two kids, your nuclear family, and everything was just fine and happy. Obviously they weren't, but that's the image people wanted to kind of relish on in America. This nice happy home wife with serving her husband, serving her kids. And this is one of the reasons why you have later in 1960s a feminist movement, because a lot of women did not like this. They did not like being stuck inside the home and seeing that as their only duty and responsibility. Also, you have the birth, the start of rock and roll. And I had to mention Chuck Berry because he recently died, I believe, uh, during this COVID crisis, unfortunately, pandemic. But he is kind of the start of rock and roll. So even though we have these happy days and this kind of like conformity in America of everyone just living nice, living happy, you have this start of like an underground movement, especially among Black Americans who aren't happy. And you have the birth of rock and roll, which is going against so much, I would say, conformist music. You have splits, you have a rock and roll guitar. It's different from anything Americans used to listen to before. And this is also during the time of Elvis, who takes inspiration from Chuck Berry. And lastly, I have to just mention we still have the Red Scare. We still have the Red Menace, the scare of communism and the Soviet Union, which I have to say, again, I don't understand it personally because I was born after it probably, but it's very strong and very much alive in America. And this is actually a comic from Captain America, who's still beloved today. He's kind of like the proto-American, strong, stands for patriotic values. And here he is fighting the commies. It even has the Soviet Union symbol, the sickle and hammer, and he's thrashing and fighting against the fascist, or I don't even know, maybe it's a communist person, I'm not sure. But this is also like the start of comic books. This is when they get really popular after World War II. So they all have an influence, but this was the time of the happy days, supposedly, but not for long. I hate to say that, but not for long. There was this image of happiness, but deep down below, you start to have the movements of revolution, of unrest, because no one likes to be in conformity, you know. But before I move on, I do have to mention this is why I showed the map in the beginning of a blurry America, where America no longer is just set in its own self. It's part of the world. It's blended into the water. It's blended into other countries. We start to have foreign entanglements in the terms of we start to no longer be isolationists, but we start to actively interfere in other countries for better and for worse. And I'm going to be quite honest, most of the time it's for worse, especially during the 1950s. I know Americans were genuinely scared of communism, but I personally still don't like what we did. But we did it. So, So anyway, we have also the birth, I should say, of I would say our version of KGB. It's the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, very famous and still alive very much today. It was created in 1947, and its primary focus was to fight communism. It wasn't to be like the FBI and hide and find spies in America. It was to do covert secret operations to try to create instability in countries that might become communist. So, and of course, I'll be quite frank, and I have to be fair. The U.S. wasn't the only one that was intervening. The USSR was. So it was a quid pro quo. Both sides were maneuvering in other countries, and we are doing it, uh, in the 1950s, and we do it throughout our 20th century, and honestly, probably even still today, we just don't know about it. But you know, it is what it is. So some of the famous foreign entanglements, or where we start to entangle ourselves in a world affairs, is we have the Suez Canal. When Egypt starts to nationalize, um, or starts to go in the direction of communism, I should say, and show support to the Soviet Union, the US pulls out its support to build the Aswan Dam. And when that happens, Nasser, who was the leader of Egypt at this time, rebels and he nationalizes the Suez Canal, which I believe was originally under international control. And in response to Nasser nationalizing, the British, French, and Israeli forces invade in 1956. So it's the start of also a messiness in the Middle East, that America becomes a part of, to be honest. Also in Lebanon, we send 5,000 Marines in 1958 to make sure that a pro-Western Christian president remains. We support him, and we want to create his stability, his ability to, rule and to stand in power. The other forces, I believe, were more Soviet oriented. They weren't necessarily Christian always, they were Muslim too. But we send in our Marines. In Guatemala, there's a gentleman named Jacobo Arbenz. He wants to nationalize the land in Guatemala that has been owned and held by the American company, the United Fruit Company. He wants to nationalize it and give it back to the people. And in response to that, the US is like, no, you're not going to take this land that belongs to this company. And so in 1954, a CIA-backed band of mercenaries, they overthrow Arbenz and they establish a military dictatorship. So it's not a good outcome. It's not. Taiwan, we don't necessarily invade, but we certainly, flex our muscles. So China wants to take over Taiwan, honestly, even still today. And in 1958, the US hears about it and says, if you do this, we will go to war with you. We threaten war. So China doesn't quite go full invasion on Taiwan, at least in some of the islands. And then lastly, we have Iran. We have the Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh. He nationalizes British Petroleum Company in 1953, which was a very big deal because the British Petroleum Company was the oil company in Iran that was pumping all the oil and taking it from Iran. And I don't believe they were giving a lot of proceeds, a lot of profits to the Iranians. So a lot were upset and they felt like, the British were stealing their oil. So they nationalized it. But this, the US is very worried about this nationalization. And they're honestly worried because the US is really reliant on oil. Beginning after World War II, we start to really become, dependent on oil for our growth, for our industries. And so the CIA recruits forces to try and capture Mossadegh, and they return the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, back to power. They're trying to create a leadership change. And this, unfortunately, has very negative consequences, especially in the 1970s when we have the Iranian hostage crisis. So it's usually not a good outcome. I'll just say that. But we do it, because we want to create stability how we see it. All right. And I do have to mention, during Eisenhower's time, we do have Nikita Khrushchev visiting the United States. And he visits for about 2 weeks, from September 15th through the 27th in 1959. So I have to mention that, it was a very big deal. This is the first time a Soviet leader is coming to the US. It's also the first time, I believe, an ethnic Ukrainian leader ever set foot into the Western Hemisphere. Nikita was from Ukraine originally. So it was a big deal. He had a grand tour. He went across Washington, D.C., New York, California, Iowa, and Pennsylvania. Part of the reason why he visited Iowa and Pennsylvania is because Iowa has a lot of farmland. It very much resembles what Ukraine is like, I think, in terms of its geography, has a lot of farming. Pennsylvania, too, has a lot of farming. And Pennsylvania has one of the largest Ukrainian um, American groups in America, a large, and Russian, but also Ukrainians. It has one of the largest. So that's interesting. And this is actually a picture of Nikita, as you see, Khrushchev with Eisenhower, and I believe that that's Nikita Khrushchev's wife. And this was a famous photograph of Nikita Khrushchev with a corn. He's holding a corn on the cob, because he's looking at the farms in Iowa, to see how we do our farming and our machines and our industries. So I think generally, I will say people took Khrushchev's visit well. You do have a few people who are like still worried about communism coming to America. You have took this comic that I found online. It was about people worrying that, if Khrushchev visits to America, he's going to be joining with his family, but also like all these threats, communist threats that are coming in. So this idea that if he comes in, then might communism come in. So, but I think for the most part, people were very happy to see him. They were intrigued. Like, what does he think of America? And I think, generally speaking, even though Americans didn't embrace him, so to speak, like, oh my gosh, we love communism and we love the Soviet Union, they were, I think, still happy to start this open relationship that really happens with Eisenhower, actually, kind of this open communication. And to be honest, I don't think we could have ever had it under Stalin or under Lenin. But it starts with Khrushchev. And as you know, Khrushchev was very critical of Stalin and his death purges. So it's the kind of the start. It's the continuation of our Cold War, but it's also the start, I think, of our thaw. It starts here, and it grows under Nixon in the 70s, I would say. All right, moving on, guys, because I have to be good on timing myself. So we have JFK, the famous 1960s president in America. Stands for John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. And we always call him JFK usually, or John Kennedy. So he was born in 1917 in Massachusetts. He was born to a well-to-do businessman and politician. His father was a politician, and he made a lot of money, from actually illegally selling alcohol during Prohibition. So his money's kind of shady, we say, but he made it, And John JFK, he graduated from Harvard, so he kind of has that New England. He's definitely a Yankee, I would say. He grows up in Massachusetts and he goes to Harvard. He does enlist in the Navy, which he gets a Purple Heart for, and he becomes a senator for Massachusetts. And I will say he has also a very famous brother, Bobby Kennedy, who is an attorney general for JFK during his presidency. And later he runs for president, but also he's assassinated too. So actually both JFK and his brother Bobby are assassinated in the same decade, 1960s. And as you know, JFK, he had very good looks. He did. Compared to our other presidents, he's probably one of the best looking ones, quite frankly. He's also one of the youngest, and at that time, the youngest ever elected president. He was, I think, 43, something like that. I'm not very good at math, so forgive me. And he was also the first Catholic president, which kind of gets ignored, but it was a very big deal. Very big deal. It's one of the reasons why some people didn't want to vote for him. They were afraid that if you elect a Catholic president, then somehow the Pope will have an influence on the president and maybe an influence on the country, because Catholics, they view their spiritual leader as the Pope. And so a lot of people had fears of that. And that fear goes back to, again, remember the Irish and this fear that they were controlled by the Pope and that they were never going to be true Americans. It's silly, but it's what people thought. He was a big advocate for civil rights. He understood that America needed to enact civil rights. He wanted to really start it. He he was not immune to the racial riots, to the racism in America. So he wanted to pass laws to finally get rid of the racism that he saw in America or alleviate it. He also was very idealistic in a sense. While he was he was anti-communist, he still believed that America had something very good to give. Um, he believed that America had something to share and that nations should cooperate with one another. He established the Peace Corps, which is a Peace Corps. If you don't know what it is, it's the group of Americans. They go to another country and they do service basically for 2 years. And it was kind of his idea that, you know how in Israel, I think in Israel or some nations, you can either join the military after you graduate high school or you can do service for the country. So he established something similar and we call it the Peace Corps. And it has its controversies too, but he started it. And, I think generally the Peace Corps means very well in the same way that the Fulbright program means well. It's not to impose America on other countries, but to help educate people about America, but also to help Americans, educate themselves about other countries. It's a two-way street. It's for other people to learn about Americans, but for Americans to learn about other people, to not live in a shell, in a hole, in a bubble, we say. So, and a major thing that happened during JFK's time was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US discovered via satellite images that Cuba had Soviet missiles. And my mom says, who was alive during this time, says this is the scariest moment probably in US history in terms of a nuclear war and a war with the Soviet Union. I mean, people were afraid that this might turn out into a war. It was a big standoff. And somehow the Soviets, I think they pulled out their missiles from Cuba. So we didn't win, but thankfully nothing happened, in my opinion. Nothing serious happened in terms of a war. And of course, JFK was not only famous himself, but so was his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. She was a big fashion icon, as you know. And she was just very popular in terms of, popular in the media, popular for photographs. She kind of represented the new wave of American fashion. She wasn't really stuck in the 1950s, so to speak, where you have more of conformist ideology in fashion. She wanted to push the buttons. And a lot of women I know looked up to her, in terms of their fashion and in terms of how she behaved. And Andy Warhol actually painted a picture of her. He called it the Red Jackie because she wore a very famous red dress. I like it. We always think of Andy Warhol with Marilyn Monroe, but he did other people like, Jackie Kennedy. And also something to note, Andy Warhol, even though he was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, his parents were from Ukraine. They were from the Lemko region of Ukraine. So he actually, his name was Andrew Warhola. So he is actually Ukrainian American directly, like his parents were from Ukraine. But you don't ever hear that in America. No one talks about his background really. I don't know why. All right, so that's JFK. And as you know, he is assassinated in November of 1963. And I would just have to mention this. For my generation, I was born in 1992. For my generation, I always remember what I was doing when September 11th happened. I do. I remember where I was, how it happened, sort of, so to speak. I remember September 11th. For my mom's generation, especially the baby boomers, people who are born after World War II, they remember where they were, what they were doing when JFK was assassinated. It was a national tragedy, really. It was. Even if you didn't like him, even if you didn't agree with his policies, what he symbolized was kind of like this new ideology, new birth of America. He was young, he had idealism, and the fact that he was assassinated by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, for no good reason, really. He was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. It broke everyone's heart in America. And everybody remembers where they were when they heard the news JFK has been assassinated. All right. And as I said with Truman, we start to have the Vietnam War. But to be honest, there's no clear start to the Vietnam War. There's no one exact year I can say. But we start to have, intervention with Truman. He gives military and financial support to France during Vietnam's war for independence. He wants to fight the North Vietnamese who are communist. And this happens in 1947. But unfortunately, Vietnam becomes divided. It has a North and a South Vietnam, and it's divided at the 17th parallel. And you have Ho Chi Minh in power, who wants to, make Vietnam communist. And this is what Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, a lot of Americans feared, that the whole domino effect, that if one country in Asia becomes communist, the others will follow. It'll be like a domino. And they were very fearful of that. So that's why we start to intervene in Vietnam. And, it starts with Truman, but it continues with Eisenhower and Kennedy. We continue to give supplies, money and weapons and military advisors to South Vietnam to fight the North Vietnamese. Unfortunately, we didn't make things better. We kind of made things worse. We backed a corrupt, unpopular leader, Diem. I think his name was Diem. His name was No Din Diem, actually. His last name was Diem, and we supported him. And he was very unpopular, which is awful, because then what happens is you end up making the North Vietnamese even more popular because people don't like the South Vietnamese leader, whom we have backed. And the U.S. sees that, and this is when we actually have a CIA coup where we murder Diem. And then we just create, honestly, even more instability in South Vietnam and in Vietnam in general. And after Diem, when he's murdered, we have we start to back a different successor, but they're not popular either. So it just makes it, it really escalates it into war, because the South Vietnam, which is anti-communist, is starting to have leaders that people don't like. And so it's creating more support for Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. So this is when you start to have the North Vietnamese have more power. And I would say this is kind of the start of the Vietnam War, this entanglement too that we're having, and our continued backing of South Vietnam, giving them lots of weapons and military support. And this is just the Vietnam War, a map of it. We have Hanoi here, the capital of North Vietnam, and we have Saigon. And this is the division of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. I won't go into the major battles, just a couple of them, or major moments in the Vietnam War later, because we do have some very big ones. But I will say Vietnam it completely overtakes the 60s, and it even, overtakes parts of the 1970s. It was at the time the longest war in America before the war in Afghanistan. And it had a tremendous effect in American culture. So I do have to focus on it to an extent, because it has a huge psychological effect on our country, I think. But this is the start of the 1960s. JFK starts it. But this is where we have the era of revolution. As the Beatles would say you want a revolution. So, and it starts, again, remember, with the civil rights movement. They're really the ones who take charge of civil rights and making sure people have rights and they have justice and equality. And it starts in the 50s and it continues in the 60s. And it inspires other groups of people. And it also creates division. I wouldn't say division, but you start to get a more powerful Black Power movement. So with the civil rights, as you remember, we had Martin Luther King Jr. and we had Malcolm X. And unfortunately, both men were assassinated. And with their assassination, you do start to get this movement within the Black rights movement, a Black Power movement. And they're a little bit, I would say, more forceful. They're more in line with Malcolm X than they are with Martin Luther King Jr. But they firmly believe that you know what, we need to seize power. Now is our time. Now is our moment. We can't, wait for people to sit down at the table and, promise equality. It's failed. In their mind, it's failed. They have to be more powerful, more militant. And so that's how you have the start of the Black Power movement. It's a spring off from the civil rights movement. It's one of the branches of the civil rights movement, and it's formed in Oakland, California, and it's very famous. It's very well known, especially in the 70s. And this is actually one of their posters. They chose the Black Panther because there is also a Black Panther comic. And it says here, an attack against one is an attack against all. The slaughter of Black people must be stopped by any means necessary. And it's very eerie, again, to read this, because this is kind of what's happening right now. This idea of like Black people being innocently murdered. It's what the protests are about right now. And so the Black Panther Party, they're hitting on something back then, and they continue to hit something today. I don't believe they're active today, or they're no longer in formation, but certainly their ideology and their legacy exists today, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement. But anyway, if you notice too, they say by any means necessary. That is the famous quote by Malcolm X. By any means necessary, we must obtain our rights. But to move onward, beyond the Black Power movement from the Civil Rights movement, we also have other movements, other groups fighting and declaring their right to freedom and justice. You have that among women, of course, one of the biggest groups, Latinos, Native Americans, LGBTQ people, and even environmental activists, and even disability activists. I didn't put them in this list, but they are very active during this time. And if you really think about it, it's all the groups in America that have, honestly been oppressed in America. Environmental activists, they haven't been oppressed, but certainly they're taking issue with the degradation of the environment, of the earth. But all of this is, in general, all of this is about equality and justice, and not only gaining equality, being equal to, but demanding equity, making sure that the wrongs that have happened in the past are fixed. Equity it's not the idea of being equal, it's about fixing the wrong so that the person who is behind is now leveled. And one of those examples is like affirmative action, where you are encouraged as a business and as a school to hire or to select minority candidates, because historically they have been not accepted into universities or into jobs. So that's one of the legacies of this movement. But anyway, it's just this, the 1960s are very much a decade of revolution. Not direct revolution in the sense of a foreign power in America, but a revolution in the way America thinks about itself and its own people. And here we have the American Indian movement. This was their logo. This was their badge. They weren't as, I don't want to say they weren't as loud, because they're just not as large as I would say, the civil rights movement in terms of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but they are still very vocal. They don't want to be ignored. And they demand justice too. The big one, I would say, one of the largest movements is the feminist movement, the movement to have women treated equally among men. And what really starts this kind of movement is with Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. She's kind of the start of the feminist movement. And she's definitely one of the leaders. And her book is all about, like, have women really been happy relegated to the home? Is this all that women can do? And what she's really talking about is this malaise, this sadness that is present among many women at this time, that's secretly within them. And they can't quite put a name to it. That's why it's called the mystique. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. But it's this idea that there is this sadness in America because they have never been treated as equal. They haven't been given opportunity. They've always been treated as second-class citizens and pushed to the home. And there's a sadness that they've never been able to really reach out and, achieve their full potential for centuries. So she really starts it, the feminine mystique. And I do have to go into a little bit of the women's liberation movement because it is a very large movement. It's just as big as the civil rights movement. So these are just some very important time periods in the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement, really. First of all, one of the big changes in women's rights, and I would almost argue it is actually the biggest change in women's rights, or it's not even a right, it's a revolution in their livelihood. It's the birth control pill, the pill. And it's monumental. And I don't really understand how it is because I grew up with it. You know what I mean? Like it's been here. But before the pill, as you know, women had to be very careful if and when they had children. And if they had children, if it was out of wedlock, they were seen as a prostitute, a whore. Uh, and the pill is one of the first things that really gives women a very powerful control of when and if they have children. So no longer does the man get to go around and do what he wants, and the women have to suffer for it. But now they can control their bodies in a way and can control kind of their destiny. It's not to say the pill is perfect. You still have pregnancies, unplanned pregnancies, but it's still very monumental because now women can control when they have kids. They can maybe pursue a career and wait to have kids. They also can decide to maybe cohabitate with a man instead of marrying a man and then having like a dating or a courtship and having children. They can, date a man or a woman, whatever. They can date someone and they can decide, maybe I like them, maybe I don't, instead of having, to wait till they get married because of fear of, sexual intercourse and children. So this, I would actually argue, in my opinion, is the biggest change in women's liberation. They can control when they have kids and if they have kids. And that affects all facets of their life, especially marriage, especially career. Another big one, though, is the Equal Pay Act. And this prohibits wage discrimination, pay discrimination between men and women. If a man and a woman performs the same job in the same workplace, they have to be equally paid. Although, to be honest, even today, this is not true. Women still make, I think, 69 cents, or is it 89 cents for every dollar? There's still a discrepancy between men and women in pay rate. Because to be honest, it's very hard to prove wage discrimination. And the burden of proof is on women. It's not on men, it's on women to prove that they are being discriminated against. Another big law or act that's passed is Title IX, and it prohibits sex discrimination in all federally funded education programs. And the federal government has a lot, especially the universities. This is a very big deal in universities. You can't give more money to men's programs and men's sports than to women. You can't give more money to the engineering department because they're mostly men, and not more money to, I don't know, the history department because it's mostly women. I'm not sure. It's just no federal program can receive unequal funding because of sex. You can't give more money to men in a federal program than women. They have to be equally funded. We also have a very big moment called, or a big amendment. It's called the Equal Rights Amendment. And this amendment would guarantee rights regardless of sex beyond the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. This amendment would make it so that women receive all their rights, but it would be regardless of sex, which is a very big deal. So no longer can you make things only for women or only for men. Both sexes are equal, and it's almost like a sex blind amendment where you don't look at someone's gender or sex. Whatever program or whatever right you have, it's equally applied. And this was a very big movement in the 70s, especially. But the amendment, just so you know, is never ratified. It's never, for amendment to pass in America, the Senate has to approve of it, but then 3/4 of the states, 75% of American states, their governments have to approve of it. and it isn't. It doesn't get 75% of states' votes. So it's never passed, actually. And one of the reasons why people were not supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment is because some people were very fearful that some of the privileges and protections that women receive would actually be lost. An example is like, we have compulsory military service, a selective service. So if you're a man and you're, I think, between the ages of 18 and 26, you have to sign up for a draft. Just in case the U.S. has a war, the military can draft you if you're a young man. And women were afraid that they would be drafted into the war. And this is a very real fear because we still have the Vietnam War going on. And a lot of women didn't want to be a part of that. They didn't want to fight, and they were afraid they'd have to do combat duty. There's also this fear that, like, if women aren't given protections, then they would not receive economic support, especially in cases of like child custody. Most of the time, child custody goes to a woman, and they receive alimony, they receive child pay. And a lot of women were afraid that if you get rid of sex-based, policies, that they're actually going to lose this right. So there were people who were very fearful of the Equal Rights Amendment. Another big one was Roe v. Wade, and this was how do I say it? This is still a very controversial issue in America. I will just say that. And the Supreme Court decided that the Constitution protects a woman's legal right to an abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy, being her first 3 months in a pregnancy. A woman has the right to an abortion. This is very controversial because there are many people in America then, and even more now today, I would say, who believe that an abortion is murder. They do. They believe that when a woman has a fetus or when she's pregnant, it's life. And when you allow her to commit an abortion, it's murder. So they are very strongly against this. But there are also many Americans who believe that this needs to be protected, this right to an abortion, because it's about the woman having the right to her body and her decisions of what happens to her body. And many of them, they don't believe it's life, so to speak, like me, life. It's a fetus in a woman's womb during her pregnancy. So in this battle of abortion between pro-life and pro-choice, it's a very controversial and it's still a very big battle in America. I don't know if it's a very big battle in Ukraine. It doesn't seem to be, but I'm not joking. There are people, I shouldn't say I'm not joking, but to be honest, there are people in America who will not vote for a candidate if they are pro-life or if they are pro-choice. And I know, to be honest, there are people who voted for Donald Trump because he promised that he would protect the pro-life group. People who are pro-life, they are against abortion. Even though they didn't like him personally, Trump, they wanted to support him because he promised to protect pro-life groups and pro-life decisions, so to speak. So it's still very relevant today. Another one, this happened in the 90s, but it's part of like the women's equality movement. It's the Violence Against Women Act, and it provides federal funding for programs that help victims of domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, stalking, and other gender-related violence. And this is a very big deal, I think, personally, because it is the federal government saying, you know what, we do care about what happens to women, and we're going to support programs, groups, and organizations that help women against domestic violence, against rape, against sexual assault. To be honest, and we still have this today, there are a lot of people in America, especially men, who believe that when a woman is raped, when she is sexually assaulted, she somehow asked for it. She somehow put herself in a position where she deserved it. And that's almost never the case. I don't really know where that ideology comes from, but it's not really based on reality. I don't think a woman ever asked to be raped or sexually assaulted. Just because a woman might dress a certain way that doesn't mean she's asking to be raped. She might want to express herself in a different way and be free, not wear a very conservative dress or something. But a woman isn't asking to be raped or assaulted. So, but there are a lot of people, a lot of men in America, who still aren't very supportive of this, who believe that, um, women have to protect themselves. It's not the responsibility of the government. But luckily, I would say the younger generation of men, I would say my generation, are much more supportive of this. Um, you know, this revolutionary mindset. It existed then and it still exists today, Um, I don't want to try to paint men as all bad. I don't want to do that because they're not. But you just have some men in very powerful positions who think poorly. Let me put it that way. All right, let me continue on. So we have Truman, we have Eisenhower, we have Kennedy, and then we have LBJ. So as you remember, as you know, JFK was assassinated. And when that happened, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, becomes the president. It's part of our Constitution that if a president dies or is killed, then the vice president automatically becomes the president of the United States. And JFK's vice president was Lyndon B. Johnson, but everybody generally calls him either Johnson or they call him LBJ for short. And he was born in 1908 in Texas, and he grew up in poverty. And I think that's a very big deal, or it's a point that I should make because it's one of the reasons why he passes some of the laws that he does later during his presidency. Um, so he grew up in poverty, but he managed to, pull himself up. I would say he served in the House of Representatives, and later he served in the Senate. So he was a senator from Texas. And after JFK was assassinated, Johnson continued Kennedy's desire to pass civil rights laws. He felt like he kind of owed it to Kennedy to continue his legacy and to fulfill the promises that JFK made. So he passed the civil rights acts. He passed, I believe, he passed two civil rights acts, and he passed a voting rights act. But he also wanted to have his own program, which he called a Great Society. And what he really meant by that is he wanted to make America great, but great in the sense for all the people that have been ignored, particularly people who were poor, who didn't have a good education, who didn't have good medical care, and he wanted to increase voting rights. So he wanted to make America fair and great for all Americans, particularly those that America ignored at the time, or that had been left behind, people who were in poverty like him. Unfortunately, during his presidency, this is during a very tumultuous period in America, the 60s. You have increased crime. You have actually increased poverty. He tried to fight it, but it's hard to control, especially when there's crime in the streets. You have greater urbanization. You also have a lot of mental illness, drug addictions. Part of that is because people feel free to try new drugs. This is the 60s. But you also have a lot of people coming from the Vietnam War who are suffering with medical issues. They're suffering with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And you have a general feeling actually during the 60s, unlike the 50s, you have a period of revolution, but you also have a period and a feeling of hopelessness and alienation, in the sense that there are a lot of Americans who felt like America, the government, either didn't meet their expectations or didn't understand how they lived. And this goes for both sides. There were, middle class white Americans who felt like America was changing for the worse, especially with desegregation, integration. They were like, what is going on to this country that I know? There were also people who were liberal, who felt like America wasn't moving fast enough in terms of its civil rights. And this is the time period when you have a lot of race riots, when you have a lot of marches, you have a lot of protests, you have looting, you do, but you also have a lot of police violence. This is when you start to hear a lot about police departments treating Black men and women unfairly, treating white protesters, white people who are protesting um, and wanting greater civil rights. You have them being mistreated by police. So this is a very tumultuous time, as I said, in America. And what makes it worse, I hate to be honest, is that Vietnam becomes worse. And it becomes worse under Lyndon Johnson. He thinks that America needs to just all out win. It needs to engage in an all out war, win the Vietnam War, stop just giving military aid and money to the South Vietnamese, send in hundreds of thousands of more troops and just wipe out the North Vietnamese. That doesn't happen. The North Vietnamese have great resolve. They are not willing to back down or surrender. So unfortunately, it ruins his presidency because he put a lot more American lives in danger, and a lot of Americans died in the Vietnam War, and he escalated the war. I think he meant it for the best in terms of let's go all out, let's win, but that's not what happened. And he died of a heart attack in the 1970s, so he didn't live a very long time afterwards. But this was Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One in 1963. So after JFK was assassinated, Johnson was immediately sworn in as president on Air Force One, which is our presidential airplane. They call it Air Force One. I don't know why, but it is. I think it's guided and controlled by the Air Force, the Air Force pilots. So, and then this is also Johnson at his ranch in Texas. I just like the photo. I'll be honest. Johnson had a very heavy hand. He was kind of a bully at times. And part of it, he felt like he was justified in being a bully because he needed to get things passed. But he was also very well known for being a Texas man. He was a Southern man. So anyway, unfortunately, this comes at a consequence because this is also the start. I'll go into it later. When you start to have the South go from Democratic states to Republican states. So Texas was originally Democrat, which is more liberal, which is more civil rights, to conservative, which is more Republican. And this starts to happen in the 60s because a lot of white Americans in the South don't like what the Democrats are doing. They feel like they themselves are being ignored. Excuse me. So anyway, as I said, Vietnam does not end with Johnson. It gets even deeper and worse. And one of the reasons why Vietnam is very difficult to win for America is because the North Vietnamese, first of all, they kind of engaged in guerrilla warfare. They weren't a typical military force. You couldn't easily point them out or see them. They're camouflage, and they're amongst South Vietnamese people. Like, you didn't know who was South Vietnamese, who was North Vietnamese. You couldn't distinguish the two forces, and there were North Vietnamese in the South. And the North Vietnamese were very well camouflaged. They hid in the jungles, they hid among the tall grasses. They also struck by ambush, often by night. So you had to fight in the dark. That's very difficult. We're not used to that. And as a result of the camouflage, the hiding of the North Vietnamese in the South, as well as the North, America bombs a lot of areas in the North and in the South, and it pours napalm and Agent Orange, which are very toxic chemicals in South Vietnam as well as in North Vietnam. And this was to try to get rid of the grass and the trees in Vietnam, to show the forces, to unhide or to find the North Vietnamese forces. So it was very toxic, though, and this has consequences even today for our military veterans who fought in Vietnam. A lot of them have very bad effects due to their exposure to Agent Orange, such as diabetes, cancer. I believe heart disease is one of them. It has really negative effects for the people in Vietnam, but also the American soldiers. So I will say where it escalates with Vietnam, it's under Johnson. but it starts really with the Gulf of Tonkin, which is an area near North Vietnam. And North Vietnam, they allegedly, that's what I read in my uh, history website, they allegedly fired on U.S. Navy ships. And in response to the North Vietnamese firing, President Johnson asked Congress to respond. And Congress basically, this is when Congress gives permission to Johnson to just escalate and do whatever he needs to win the war. And this happens in 64. We also have an Operation Rolling Thunder, which is when the US begins a very, very long campaign of bombing of North Vietnamese targets. It happens in 1965. And at first, military targets were hit, but months and years later, we start to hit civilian targets. So innocent people are dying more and more. And this is one of the reasons why the Vietnam War was not popular then. People are hearing from the news, from the television, from the radio about the Vietnam War. Unlike World War II, which was a little bit distant and people heard on the radio, Vietnam is heavily televised, it's heavily photographed. So people know month by month, day by day, what's going on. And you can't hide the unjust acts that the US is committing on the Vietnamese. You can't hide that we're hitting civilians, that we're killing innocent civilians. You can't hide it. So this is one of the reasons why also Vietnam is becoming very unpopular among Americans. So it's why the war, it's another reason why the war is hard to win, because the morale among Americans is very low. You need the support of the American people to win a war. How are you going to do that if they feel terrible about the war? Another major moment in Vietnam was the Tet Offensive. And during a Buddhist holiday, which is called Tet, over 80,000 Viet Cong, which is the North Vietnamese troops, they made a surprise attack on major cities in South Vietnam. They even attacked the American embassy in Saigon, which had never happened. And the US and South Vietnamese forces, they fought back and won, but it came at a very heavy cost. We killed more people than the Viet Cong killed. So we actually doubled the number of casualties when we fought versus when the Viet Cong fought. So again, it's kind of like this back and forth with Vietnam. You know, we win this battle, but we kill so many people to win it. So this is why we have a hard time winning the war, but also have a hard time supporting the war. Because yeah, we're winning, but we're killing a lot of innocent people at times too. So this is why the war is very controversial, even today in America. And I do have to recommend a movie. I do. It's a very good movie. I like it. It's called The Deer Hunter, and it takes place during the Vietnam War. And it's about a group of guys. They're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And what's interesting is these group of men, Christopher Walken, Meryl Streep, and well, Meryl Streep's not a man, but she's an actress in the movie. Robert De Niro, they star in this movie, and they play. They're a group of friends, and they're actually, I believe, at least Eastern European, Russian, or Ukrainian. The movie doesn't exactly say what their background is, but we know that they're at least Russian, or they're Slavic, or they're Ukrainian. They're Slavic at least. They're Eastern European Americans. And, you know, you see a little bit of that community in Pennsylvania. Remember, I said that Pennsylvania has a lot of Ukrainians. So you see that a little bit in this movie. So I recommend it. You see a little bit of, you know, Slavic Americans in America. That's where the movie is set. But the movie is about these men having to go and be drafted into the Vietnam War and the horrors that they witness and the difficulties of the war, both the good, the bad, and the ugly in the war. So I recommend it. It won Best Picture for the Academy Awards, the Oscars, and won Best Picture in 1978. It's a very well-known film, well-done film. I recommend it. So I just had to put that in there. All right, so just to summarize a little bit about the 60s, it was called the era of, or the decade of free love. But I'll be honest, that free love came with a lot of riots, it came with a lot of battles. Yeah. And as I said, the 60s were quite a decade. They were a tumultuous decade. And part of that was you had four assassinations of very well known leaders, civil rights leaders, particularly. You have JFK, John F. Kennedy, you have Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Bobby Kennedy. All four were civil rights advocates and they were assassinated and killed. You have the pill, which revolutionized women's rights, gave them more freedoms. You have, civil rights movements. These are Latino students protesting. Columbus didn't discover America, he invaded it. So it was just the support of, Latinos fighting and recognizing that America has committed wrongs in the past and it needs to fix them. You also have a movie like The Graduate come out in the 1960s. And The Graduate movie, I recommend it too. It's very good. It's with Dustin Hoffman. And the movie, it's a good movie in the sense that it really focuses on. So Dustin Hoffman's character plays a recently graduated college student in America during the 60s. And the movie really does a good job focusing on the malaise, on kind of the alienation and unhappiness I was talking about that some Americans feel. And he doesn't feel it so much because he's white and he hates the segregation or the desegregation in America. It's the fact that all this change is happening in America. Where does he stand in it? And he ends up engaging in an affair with an older woman, Mrs. Robinson, and he also falls in love with her daughter. It's a very classic American film, and I recommend it. But you can also see kind of like the struggle that maybe one American has in where does he fit into 1960s America with all these changes. Part of the changes was the hippie movement, the free love or the free movement, free fashion. Here they, no boundaries, so to speak. Here they painted a van very colorfully. Hippies tended to dress very freely. Big bell-bottom jeans, long hair, very 1950s, very not 1950s, which was very conformist. So they really symbolize the 60s in that way. You also have great music in the 60s. You have the Beach Boys, which are interesting because, they are part of like this movement of like, we want this freedom. We want to explore. We want to kind of be our own selves, our individual selves. And they had a lot of music actually about that. They had their Surfing in the USA, but they kind of represent kind of like the freestyle of the 60s. And also, we also have a very famous place called the Stonewall Inn. It's actually in New York City. It was also the site of a very famous protest and uprising by LGBTQ people in America. A group of policemen actually found out that there was this Stonewall Inn, that there was a lot of gay people, a lot of trans people, a lot of queer and Black people in this famous gay bar. And they went into the bar and they arrested many. They got into a fight with the people in the bar, and they even killed and shot some of the people in the bar, the inn they call it. So it's a very famous place for LGBTQ America. And it's just to show how, this is all part of the movement of revolution, of change, but what many people have called free love, nonconformity. And just before I move on to the 1970s, again, I'm very sorry. I know I'm very slow and this lecture is taking some time, but a lot happens in America, I can't ignore it. And I want to give you a good, thorough history. So, of course, too, during this time period in the 50s, but also 60s, and even to today, we have the space race in America. I don't know if some of you've heard, we just had SpaceX, which is a private company by Elon Musk. He did a joint operation with NASA, which is our space program in America. He sent a rocket, or well, really, he sent a spaceship with 2 American astronauts into the International Space Station. I think this happened actually this past weekend. So it was a very big deal because it's the first time that America has sent individuals into space in the past 9 years. We've had to cooperate with Russia and send our men through the Kazakhstan space field. That's where I believe Russia sends its astronauts and other astronauts into space. So it was a big deal. They had it on the news. But the real beginnings of the space race, we call it in America, happened with Sputnik. It's the first Sputnik in 1957. And it's the first satellite to enter space. And to be quite frank, it scared a lot of Americans. They were both in awe, but they were also very frightened by Sputnik, because first of all, it was the first object floating around in space that they could see that was man-made. It was also from their enemy, the Soviet Union, so it freaked them out. And really what freaked them out was just the unknown of it. Like, was it spying on the US? But also the unknown of, if the Soviet Union can launch a satellite into space, what else can they launch? Can they send nuclear weapons all the way here? It scared a lot of people. And this is actually a photograph of the first Sputnik. I believe this is an actual photograph. I couldn't find many. In 1957, this is what it looked like. And the US does respond to Sputnik. We're not just watching it. We also launch our own satellite into space in 1958. It's called the Explorer, but no one really, you don't learn about it in history really, because it's a response. Sputnik is the first, so that's the one that everybody remembers. But it's launched into space in 1958, the same year that NASA is established. We had a space program before, but this is the well-known one. We formalize it and we call it NASA, and it stands for, I think, the National Aeronautical Space Agency. It's a very long name, but that is its logo. And I'm sure many of you have seen it, because I don't know why, but when I was in Ukraine, so many teenagers in Ukraine had a t-shirt or a hoodie that said NASA, and it was the logo, the NASA logo. And I was like, why do they have this? This is an American agency, this is interesting. Maybe that's why they have it, because it's American and it's kind of a rebellion to the Soviet Union. I'm not sure, or to Russia, but I thought that was interesting. There were so many NASA apparel, t-shirts and hoodies, sweatshirts that I saw in Ukraine. And as you all know, there was also Yuri, I'm going to mispronounce his name, so forgive me, Gagarin. That's how we say it in America. Forgive me if I mispronounce any, Slavic names, Russian, Ukrainian names. It's just the American in me. But Yuri Gagarin, as we all know, he was the first human in space, April 12th, 1961. I think he was only up there for several hours, but still, it doesn't matter. He gets to be the first human in space, which is cool. And again, like the Explorer, America is not far behind. 1 month later, we also send our American into space, Alan Shepard. But again, no one really knows him. At least I didn't know who he was. I know Yuri Gagarin, but I didn't know Alan Shepard before I researched the space race. So the Soviets, in terms of space, are definitely beating the US. They are. They even put the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. She goes in 1963, and the US is not even close behind this one. We don't put our first American woman into space until 1983, Sally Ride. I don't know why. Anyway, so we take a while to put our first woman in space. So the Soviets are winning. I would definitely say that. But we do have a very monumental moment, at least in America, for our space program. And that's the Apollo 11 mission, which is when we put our American astronauts on the moon, and they become the first humans to land on the moon. And we all know the famous image of the American astronaut Neil Armstrong putting the flag on the moon. He has that famous image. And whether you think this or not, in America, it was a very big deal, and we consider it like one of the biggest triumphs in the space race. And a lot of people, at least in America, thinks that even though the Soviets had these other accomplishments like Sputnik and Yuri, the Americans were still able to do something far more monumental, and that's to put the first humans on the moon. It was also monumental because it was kind of the first time a foreign nation claims property in space. Us putting the flag on the moon is kind of saying this is ours. So I don't know where we go from here, but anyway, it was a very monumental moment, at least in American history. And it's something that we're very proud of. We brag about. Whether you agree with it or not, it is what it is. It's a very monumental moment. And there was a very famous quote that Neil Armstrong said, who landed the first man on the moon. And I think it's interesting because it actually is an English lesson. He said, we all know the quote. That's one small step for man, or we don't actually know if he said a man or man, one giant leap for mankind. So when you have the article a in there, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. When you say a man, it just means one human being. So he's that one human being. It's a small step for him, but it's a giant leap for humanity. When you get rid of that a, which some people do when they quote Neil Armstrong, when you say that's one small step for man, it makes it sound like when you say man in the general without an article, it means humanity. So it's redundant. When you say that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, it means the same thing. It's redundant. It's the same meaning. So it's interesting. People don't know whether he put an A or didn't say an A. But regardless, it's a very famous quote, and it does have a very strong meaning. And I think that's why Americans see Apollo 11 as so big. Even though it was just a human on the moon, it was a very large achievement in American eyes for humanity. And I had to just show you this movie. As you can all tell, I'm a big movie buff. There's a good movie called October Sky. It's with Jake Gyllenhaal. And it's a really nice movie that it's about a young boy growing up in West Virginia, in a very poor area of Virginia. And it's him growing up when Sputnik is launched. And he sees, this is actually him and his friends watching Sputnik over the sky. Because remember, Sputnik orbited the Earth, so you could see it from America, from anywhere, from anywhere in the world. And the Americans saw it, and he sees it, and he's inspired by Sputnik's journey across the world, and he wants to build a rocket, and he enters into a contest at his local school, I think, and he builds a rocket, and he later, I think, actually becomes an astronaut. This is based on a true story. But it's a good movie. It's a nice family film. So that's why I recommend it. And it's also one of the few films that really focuses on Sputnik and the space race and what it meant to Americans, especially young Americans. So I recommend it. All right. So moving beyond the 60s, we are starting to get into the 1970s with Richard Milhous Nixon. That is his middle name, Milhouse. For those who don't know, Milhouse is also the name of Bart Simpson's friend in the Simpsons TV show. And he kind of is supposed to be a little bit like Richard Nixon, I think. But his name is Milhouse. But Richard Nixon had the original name, Milhouse. Anyway, he is known by Tricky Dick, and you will find out later why his nickname is Tricky Dick. Dick, first of all, is a nickname for Richard. It is also a profane word, but it's also a nickname for Richard in America. And I think in England, but I'm not sure. At least in America, it's a nickname. So he was called Tricky Dick, and you'll find out why. But he was born in California in 1913, and he grew up as a Quaker. And Quakers are they're a Christian sect that were originally actually from like the Pennsylvania area, but they are strongly They're against excesses. They're against alcohol. They're against cursing. They're against like excess or vices, sins, so to speak. He's a very modest Christian, I would say, and he's a very pious one, I would say. Um, he attends college actually in his local city in California. He attends college in California, and then later, Richard Nixon, he goes to law school, and even though it was against his religion, he actually joins the Navy because the Quakers don't believe in violence. But he joins the Navy, and he does mostly, I think, behind the scenes stuff. But he does join the Navy during World War II. I think he feels like many Americans at this time to join. But he joins the Navy. He does well, and after he comes back from the Navy from World War II, he has a law firm. But then he decides, after being in law for a little bit, to run for the House of Representatives, and he wins. He wins his seat, and later he's actually chosen by Eisenhower to be vice president. He's one of the youngest vice presidents. He was 39 when he was Eisenhower's vice president. But then actually he loses the presidency to JFK. So, Richard Nixon has a history of winning and losing. But finally, he's elected to presidency in 1969. He wins. And during his presidency, the US does formally end the Vietnam War. Again, we've been in Vietnam for a very long time, at least since the 50s, starting in the 40s. But he ends the Vietnam formally. He does it. There's an expression he uses. I can't remember what his expression was. But he does end it peacefully, generally speaking. Although he later does invade Cambodia, and that turns into a mess, but I won't go into that. But anyway, he ends the war, and he even ends the military draft, actually. Before, when the US has a war or a conflict, we have a draft where we, draft young American men, and he ends it. So now, even today, our military is voluntary. You don't have to join the military when you're 18 or 26. And if there's a war, you don't have to join the war. So you're no longer drafted. You can volunteer to be in the military, which I think is personally a very good decision. Nixon is very tough on crime. As I said before, with under Johnson, crime has risen, poverty has actually risen. And Nixon gets very tough on crime, and he starts to target a certain sector of crime called not called drugs, but drugs. And he calls it the war on drugs, which unfortunately unfairly targets minorities. It goes after a lot of Black and brown Americans. He basically thinks that the cause of the drugs in America is not so much white people, but Black people. So a lot of Black men, a lot of brown men too, are incarcerated or put into jail in America. So this is the start of our war on drugs, and we really still have it today. And it starts under Nixon. On a different side, though, when it comes to foreign policy, Nixon is much more open to new relationships, actually, which is interesting because Nixon, when he was in the House of Representatives, when he was a vice president, he was a hardcore anti-communist. He was, kind of part of the McCarthy era. He supported McCarthy. He was a well-known anti-communist, but he sees a moment to open diplomatic ties with China. Part of the reason why he does it is because he sees how China and the Soviet Union are fighting and that they're rivals. And he thinks that by being friends with China, he'll further, he'll make it so that China will support America and not support the Soviet Union. Kind of like the expression we have in America, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, China is the enemy of the Soviet Union, so we'll be friends with them. Kind of like that. It's called triangular diplomacy. And so he engages with China, and he actually meets Mao Zedong. And it's the first time that an American meets with communist China, and it happens in 1972. So he meets with China, he starts to open up relationships. And we all know what happens once the US starts a relationship with China. It opens up and it grows. And now we're actually in a very weird spot now with Trump in China. But nevertheless, China starts to open up not to America only, but to the world. And the consequences of that are enormous. So Nixon not only opens up with China, but he wants to open up with the Soviet Union, actually, which I know sounds weird because I just said the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But I think he sees this as kind of like playing both sides. Let's be friends with China, but hey, let's maybe be friends with Soviet Unions. Maybe at times use the one against the other. I don't know. But nevertheless, he wants to kind of start and increase the thaw that happened under Eisenhower and kind of easing the tension between the Soviet Union and the US. Nixon really wants to expand and grow on. And he meets with the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev. He's the first American, I think, president to do so. Maybe Eisenhower did also. Or Eisenhower was supposed to meet Khrushchev in Moscow, but I believe his trip was canceled because the U-2 scandal, the U-2 plane bombing. But anyway, so Nixon is the first actually American president to meet with the Soviet leader, and he meets with Brezhnev in 1972. And here he is. I like this photo, actually. This is Nixon. I don't know what they're saying, what they're doing, but it's kind of funny. And he and Brezhnev have open arms. They're talking. I don't know about what, but I think it's kind of a funny photo. I like it. And one thing that they do for sure is they sign the SALT I treaty, and this limited intercontinental ballistic missiles. And many historians say that this is actually the start of détente or the thawing of relations. I would say personally it starts really under Eisenhower, but people say it's really Nixon who starts it. And they're historians, they're probably right, I'm not. But it's the start of détente when the US starts to speak more and open up more with the Soviet Union. And this is why he is nicknamed Tricky Dick. He has the Watergate scandal. And after the scandal occurs, he has to resign. And it's a very big scandal. But before I move on, I'll just show you this. This is a little comic that I found of the détente. This was from 1973. This was a political cartoon of the Soviet Union and the US kind of like opening up relations. And the caption is the odd couple. And here you have the typical Soviet mascot bear and the US eagle. And they have a child and they're now like buddy buddies. I think it's just funny. I liked it. It was just a great cartoon I found. But let me actually go ahead for 1 second onto Watergate. So Watergate, I'll try to go through this quickly, but it was a very big scandal in America. Before Bill Clinton has his scandal with Monica Lewinsky in the 1990s, the other scandal that was bigger than that one was Watergate. And Watergate is called Watergate, the scandal, because it was at the Watergate Hotel. And this is actually the Watergate Hotel here. It's still present. It still exists in America. It's in Washington, D.C. It's actually a historic building, so you can't tear it down. I personally think it's very ugly, but it doesn't matter what I think. It's a very famous building, and it will be there forever until, something changes. But it was the site of the scandal. And during the 1972 presidential campaign, when the Democrats and Republicans are about to nominate their candidates, newspapers uncover a break-in, kind of like a robbery, but not quite a robbery. It was a break-in. And it occurred in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And they quickly uncover it, and it becomes a scandal. And it's a scandal because what they find out is that Watergate Hotel is the headquarters for the Democrats and their national committee to elect a president, basically. And they find out that basically Richard Nixon's friends or the committee to reelect the president, who is Richard Nixon, they find out that people from that committee broke into the hotel and spied on the Democrats. And when this news broke out, a lot of Nixon administration officials resigned because they knew what they did was wrong. And some were actually later convicted of offenses connected with the cover up. So not only was there a break in, but there was a cover up by Nixon and his administration. They tried to hide that this had happened. And it was a very big scandal. It was the first time something like this ever broke out in terms of like kind of cheating and spying. And Nixon denied any personal involvement. He said, I had nothing to do with it. But then it made things worse because then later they found out through tape recordings that he did. He was very personally involved in this cover up. And he was trying to, in fact, divert attention from the investigation and tried to distract people from the investigation and to cover it up. So not only did he know about the break-in, he was involved in the cover-up. And because of this is unlawful presidential, acts. It's an abuse of power, basically. He is impeached by the Senate. And because he's impeached by the Senate, he resigns 1 week later in August of 1974. And his vice president, kind of like Lyndon Johnson, takes over as president. And that's why he's called Tricky Dick, because he was kind of like a trickster. He was tricky. And I do just want to mention again, under Nixon, we have the end of the Vietnam War. And now I remember what it's called. It's called Peace with Honor. That's what he wanted to have. The Nixon would slowly withdraw U.S. forces and have a ceasefire between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese. So, it did end the fighting, but not for long. Eventually, the communist forces in Vietnam took over the South and unified the nation. So, I don't really know, to be honest, I don't really know what good America did in invading Vietnam. I will say there were two main reasons why the U.S. struggled to win the war, why it surrendered. First of all, it was the guerrilla warfare. It was a totally different warfare than what we had seen in World War II and in World War I. Enemy forces were covered among civilians. They were camouflaged well. So they weren't easy to fight. They weren't easy to target. You can't just bomb one area and great, you bombed the enemy. No, the enemy is intermixed with the civilians, the local population. Are you going to bomb those civilians too? Well, it turns out we did, unfortunately. But again, as I said too, another reason why this war was hard to win is because there's an extensive media coverage of the war. So Americans are seeing on TV the war, and they're seeing the horrors of the war. They're seeing the photographs. They're not immune. They're not hidden from the horrors of it. So there's not a lot of support among Americans. And I will say the Vietnam War, it's not as costly as the Civil War, or I think even the World War II, but it's still costly. Over 55,000 American soldiers died. And thousands today still suffer a lot of medical hardships because of the Agent Orange exposure, the toxic chemical. So it has lasting effects. And I do have to show this photograph. I know it's a little bit graphic, but it's a very famous one. I think it's one of the most famous during the war. And it was a photograph of children running from a napalm attack in 1972. A South Vietnamese plane accidentally dropped napalm on its own troops and civilians. And napalm is very toxic. It burns your skin, it burns your eyes. And so this little girl, she ripped off her clothes because they were burning. They were burning from the toxins. They were burning from the fumes of the napalm. So it's a very famous photograph. So you have to imagine, this is what Americans are seeing at home, these photographs. And so it's no wonder, to be honest, Vietnam is a struggle to get home support. And when a lot of soldiers came home during the Vietnam War, they faced a lot of criticism and resistance. Today, people understand the war more, so there isn't there isn't this negative tone to the Vietnam veterans, but people still are very negative on the war in terms of why on earth were we in Vietnam, you know? All right, guys, thanks for staying with me. I know if this is long, but we're almost done. This is where we have Ford and Reagan. So Ford, as you know, took over Nixon because Nixon resigned. So he becomes president, and his name is Gerald R. Ford. He's not a very well-known president, to be honest, and he only is president for 3 years. And when he took over America, it was a very difficult America to unite, so to speak, in part because of the Nixon scandal and in part because of the Vietnam War too, still. But Gerald Ford, he was born in Nebraska, but he grew up in Michigan. And he actually attended University of Michigan and played football. And he was even offered to play in the National Football League, our big national football league. Like he was recruited by football teams, but he decided to not do that. He attended law school, and then he later joined the Navy, like a lot of our presidents, interesting enough, and he became a lawyer after he joined the Navy and served time in the Navy. He was a lawyer, again, like a lot of our other presidents, interesting enough. He was elected to the House of Representatives, and he was in the House of Representatives until he was nominated by Richard Nixon to be his vice president. And when he's the president after Nixon, he actually does something very controversial, and he pardons Nixon. He basically says that you are forgiven and that we will not press any criminal charges on you. And this was a very controversial move because a lot of Americans thought Nixon was absolutely guilty. And I think even Nixon knew he was guilty himself too. But pardoning means he gets no criminal consequence. So, and many people say that this is why Ford couldn't win the election in 1976, because he pardons Nixon, whom everybody at this time, a lot of people hated or thought he was corrupt. And Ford, he struggled with a recession and inflation because we have a Middle East oil embargo. In 1973, OPEC countries in the Middle East decided to do an oil embargo. They decided to cut off oil shipments to the US. I think because we supported Israel during the Israeli war with Egypt, I think. I'm really bad on Israeli history, forgive me. But basically, we supported Israel, and the Arab nations were very upset, so they cut off oil to the US. And at this time, we were very dependent on oil from abroad, especially from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from Kuwait. So it really hurts us. It affects us greatly. We have a recession because our factories, our businesses, our cars all rely on oil. So he had to deal with that. And while he's dealing with the recession, he's also trying to cut federal spending, which is kind of actually not what you want to do when there's a horrible economic recession. You want to help to grow the economy, so you shouldn't cut federal spending. But he did it, because he's a conservative, he's a Republican. And generally, Republicans believe in a small government federal budget. They don't want to expand the federal budget or spending. They want to cut it or make it smaller, conserve it. He also, in terms of his foreign policy, he took a neutral stance between the war with Israel and Egypt. I think he saw that the U.S. support for Israel was not really a good thing, at least in terms of foreign relations with Arab nations. So he was neutral between Israel and Egypt. They had a war at this time. That's one of his big positions or big things of his presidency. And he also continued Nixon's policy of détente. He continued the relations with the Soviet Union. So here he is meeting with Leonid Brezhnev in November of 1974. And I don't know why, I really like this photo of Ford in a heavy fur coat and a hat. In some ways, he looks very Soviet, I think. I just think it's a funny image. I like it. It's great to see. So I think personally, détente and the opening of relations is a very good thing for America. And this is him. He doesn't have a lot of photos, honestly, because his term in office wasn't very long. But this is him being sworn in as president. a very famous image of him. So that's Ford. And after Ford, we have Carter. So Carter, it's short for Jimmy Carter. We call him Jimmy Carter or Carter. And he is the president after Ford. And his real name is James Earl Carter Jr. He's born in 1924 in Plains, Georgia. But he grew up in a Baptist household and on a peanut farm, actually. He was a peanut farmer. So he is a Southern Christian Democrat. So he kind of appeals to a lot of people. And he attended the Naval Academy. He worked for the Navy. He was in the Navy. And then he later enters local politics. And he's elected governor of Georgia in 1970. And he later runs for president and wins in 1977. And his big motto, kind of pulling away from Nixon and Ford, he believed, or that he wanted a government that was competent and compassionate. He was a pretty idealistic president. And this was both good and bad. It was good because, he aspired for good things for America, but he was idealistic at a time when America was going through some rough patches. So he didn't do so well, so to speak. He inherited an economy that continued to go down after Ford. So, Ford tried to fix the economy. He couldn't really, in part because of the spending cuts. And Carter also tried to get the economy back up. And he did, make some improvements, but it was so far down that it was hard to get above the water, so to speak. We were so far in the deep end that getting to the shallow end was going to take some time. So this is one of the reasons why, he wasn't reelected. But under Carter was very idealistic. Again, he wanted to change the government attitude. He hired a record number of minorities into government office, and he did create a more efficient government. He tried to create a better civil service. He created a Department of Education, which we didn't have before. And he also oversaw the Camp David Agreement, which was a mutual recognition between Israel and Egypt in 1978. So it was kind of the first of peace treaties with Israel and its neighbors. And he was the first to do it. So he has that as part of his foreign policy, as part of his presidency. However, when it comes to the Soviet Union, we don't really have détente. We kind of go the opposite direction of Ford and Nixon. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the U.S. decided to pass a wheat embargo. We decided to not export any wheat to the Soviet Union, which we had been doing. And we also boycotted the 1980s Olympics in Moscow. And we did this because we didn't agree with the Soviet invasion. We believed that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan for dubious reasons, for kind of imperialism, so to speak. Even though the Soviet Union claimed, maybe rightfully so, that the Afghani leaders needed Soviet Union help. I don't know enough about this war to say one way or the other, but this is what we did. We didn't like it, so we boycotted it. Very ironic considering 20 years later, we would invade Afghanistan. And we would also ask for Russia's help, I think. So it's kind of funny how history goes back around again, And I will say something that also happens during Carter's administration, and what really kills Carter in terms of his popularity, is the Iranian hostage crisis. This is when a group of Iranian students, they take over the U.S. embassy in Tehran, and they actually hold, I think, 52 American hostages in the embassy. And they also burn the American flag. They're very angry by the U.S. intervention in the Middle East. They're angry that we support, we're against nationalist movements. We have intervention that in Iran, we have the Shah that we try to put in power. They don't like that. So there's the revolution in Iran, and they take over the embassy, and they take over 52 Americans as hostage. And Carter, he tries to rescue these hostages, and he even has a military mission go out and try to rescue them, but it fails. So that just hurts American psyche, American morale, and it's why he loses, to be honest. But before I move on to Reagan in the 80s, I'll just kind of give a little synopsis of the 70s. I know we kind of went through it quickly, but the 70s, people call it the me decade, or that's what I've been told, by some people. That's what it's kind of known as, the me decade. So the 70s, whereas the 60s, you had a lot of revolutions, you had a lot of protests for rights for all people, all Americans, especially minorities. The me decade is when Americans start to turn away from other people, other Americans, and towards themselves, me. I think Americans at this time were getting really tired of the 60s revolutions, the 60s protests, because the protests were sometimes violent and they were tired of it. Um, um, and so you have, the me decade, and you have protests, and you have people, especially among white Americans who are anti-integrationist. They don't like the integration of black and white students into schools. So they protest in Boston in 1975. You also have the ERA movement, which, remember, was the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA amendment, but you have people who also protested against that. And you have people who protested for it. And here you have demonstrators saying we are the 51% minority. They're talking about women getting the right to vote and have other rights. And this was a funny sign. It said, we have the right to vote for the man of our choice. It's kind of like one step forward, two steps back. You have the right to vote for the man of our choice. Well, what about if it's a woman? But anyway, I thought that was a funny sign. So you have still this era of protest, but slowly America is kind of crumbling in itself, I would say. And you also just have a weird, strange fashion. I had to show here the Bee Gees. I like the Bee Gees personally, but they were a really big hit in the 70s. And you can see by their fashion that they're very different from the 60s. They got long hair, which is a continuation of the 60s, but they have bell bottom jeans, tight pants, waists, kind of matching outfits. I think they really represent, in some ways, 70s music, the disco fever. Here we also have the Kent State University protests and shooting. And this is when Americans protested at Kent State University in Ohio. They protested Nixon's bombing of Cambodia, which Nixon did to try to move out the North Vietnamese in Cambodia. And they protested and they were shot. The 4 students were shot. And I think why I put this photo, I think this was a very pivotal moment in America in terms of these protests have gotten us far, but there comes a point when the protests are also killing us. And this is when you actually have protests, but in terms of protests for civil rights, you start to have them less and less in the 70s. You still have the ERA, but the 70s don't have nearly as many protests as the 60s, I would say. And one of the reasons why is because they've become deadly and people want to stop losing their friends, losing their family members. Another thing about the 70s, as you know, with Ford and Carter, we had a really bad economy. And this is also the start of globalization in America, when we start, putting our manufacturing and our factories into other countries, especially in Asia, like Vietnam, actually, also Philippines, China, of course. And we have this area of America called the Rust Belt. And it's called the Rust Belt because, like rust, when you have a metal that decays from water, it rusts. Well, the Rust Belt is the area in America that used to have a lot of manufacturing with metal, in terms of metal themselves, but also automobiles. A lot of factories in America were in this area. It's part of New York, it's part of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, even part of Illinois, Wisconsin. All this area used to be part of the Rust Belt, and it's dying during the 70s because of globalization. And it's so the automobiles and the factories are shutting down. They're rusting. And this whole area too, just so you know, this is the coal region of America. This is also slowly dying as well. So the two go hand in hand. So it's the 70s are very much I don't want to say sad decade in America, but whereas the 60s had all this revolution and changes, the 70s were pretty depressing. a lot of bad things happened. There was scandal, there was a poor economy. People are tired of the protests, I think. And it's one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan wins. Ronald Reagan, who many just call Reagan, he wins in part because he's optimistic about America. At a time when many Americans feel really crappy, to be honest, really bad about their country, from the Vietnam War, from the economy, from the Nixon scandal, from Carter, from the Iranian hostage crisis, they feel bad. But he promises a better America. And in fact, one of his logos during his campaign for presidency, he says, "Let's make America great again," which is actually the same phrase, almost the same phrase that Trump uses. He said, "Make America great again." Reagan said, "Let's make America great again." And I think Trump bought the rights to Reagan's quote or slogan. But anyway, a little bit about Ronald Reagan, the last president that I'll cover. Ronald Reagan was a much older president. He was born in 1911 in Illinois. Um, and he's very famous because he was actually a Hollywood film star. He acted in college plays, he loved it. He was a radio broadcaster, and later he became an actor in 53 Hollywood films. So he started in a lot. He was well known, I think. He wasn't Clark Gable, he wasn't Cary Grant or James Stewart, but he was still, I think, well known. Um, and why this is important to mention is Reagan was a great communicator. He was. He was just like JFK. He was very good at speaking to crowds. He made people feel good. He was very comfortable too. And he was very steadfast in his attitude. If he believed in something, he could convince you of it. He was just very good at speaking and communicating. He didn't come off as pushy, as too nice or too mean. Like I think a lot of people still liked him, even if they didn't agree with his policies. And his communication, I think, is what wins people over during his presidency. And also in California, he wins the governor uh, of California. He becomes a governor of California in 1966, and he has no political experience. But it doesn't really matter in some ways. He tells people what they want to hear. He communicates a lot of feelings that Americans have. And in the end, that kind of wins. And we kind of saw that with Trump. Trump has no political experience, but he kind of communicated in a way that a lot of Americans felt. So that made him kind of popular among many Americans. Not all, but many. Um, so he's governor of California for 2 terms. And then later he becomes president. Um, in 1981, he becomes president of the United States, and his vice president is George W. Bush Sr., who later becomes president, and he's the father of George Walker Hubert Bush Jr., the second George Bush. And when he's elected president, he's the oldest president ever elected at the time, 69 years old. Now I think it's Trump, who I think was 74. I don't know. But anyway, and he starts his presidency very interestingly, kind of with success, actually. He's shot in his first year of office. It was an assassination attempt, but he recovers and he bounces right back up. And this really makes him popular because it kind of shows that he got lucky, he survived, but his quick recovery showed that he was optimistic, he had resolve, he had stamina, he could, recover and carry things forward. He also ended the Iranian hostage crisis. What Carter failed to do, he was able to succeed in. And that was a big, victory. And his big thing, again, like I said, is he was very optimistic. And he even had a slogan, "Happy days are here again." Because he felt like, so many people from the 70s, 1970s felt very depressed and sad. He wanted to turn around the sadness that many Americans felt in the 70s. He was optimistic. And the ways that he was going to turn America around was he believed that the government was too big. So ever since FDR in the 1930s, America is just too massive. Its spending is unbelievable. Its bureaucracy is too big. We need to cut the government down. It's too big. So he did. I try to decrease the government. He cut certain agencies, departments. He also cut government spending. He cut taxes, um, but he largely cut them for wealthy Americans because what he believed in is if you cut taxes for the wealthy, the people who have the majority of the money, it'll trickle down. If they have money then to spend, they'll spend it on the economy and they'll, help the economy for poor and middle class Americans. To be quite frank, that's not how it works. When wealthy people get tax breaks, then they often just help themselves or they keep it to themselves. They don't share it with poor people or middle class people. So trickle down economics doesn't work, to be honest, but it's still something that a lot of people believe in and they advocate for. And he was one of the first advocates for it. Interesting enough, though, even though he believed the government was too big and the government spent too much money, he did believe that there was one exception, and that exception was the military. And he actually increased military spending by 35% because he believed that like America needed to be able to flex its muscles. It needed to be strong. And the way that you're strong as a country is through your military. Um, and remember, this is still the Cold War. So he still felt like America had to be a great military power against the Soviet Union, so to speak. Even though he wanted to cut down the government, the one exception, even today for conservatives and Republicans, which Reagan was, generally speaking, Republicans and conservatives don't like big government spending, especially on social programs. But the one exception is the military. And our military budget, as you all know, is astronomically high. And when it comes to his optimism, part of that optimism, he felt that why he was so optimistic is he felt like America just lost itself a little bit morally, but that it could find itself again. The America of the 1950s and 40s, what made America great back then, it had been lost because of the turmoil and the protests of the 1960s and the 70s even. But he is determined to find and regain that morality again in America because he still believed that America was a great country. It just kind of lost its way in the 60s and 70s. And this is where you have, just so you know, the rise of the conservative right, the Christian right, I should say, the new right, as we say in American history. This was a group of people from the right wing or the conservative party in America, the conservative groups in America. A lot of evangelical Christians start to gain power under Reagan. They start to have influence because he himself was also a very big Christian, evangelical Christian supporter. And they start to have a lot of power in the Republican Party. And it's very influential in the Republican Party because the Republican Party still today is largely Christian and it's largely influenced and still has a lot of influence, so to speak, from the Christian right, from evangelical Christians. So I just want to mention that. This is the start of when the Republican Party really becomes evangelical Christian or has that evangelical power in it. And his big thing when it comes to his foreign policy was peace through strength, which meant that the US was willing to negotiate still with other people. We weren't going to go into all out wars. We would be willing to negotiate, but we'd always be from a position of strength. And so that's what we try to do in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We sent military arms and money to anti-communist forces in those areas because we still wanted to show strength, like through military spending and military support, but we weren't going to invade like Vietnam. We were going to negotiate. We were going to be a part of the movement to get rid of communism, but we weren't going to invade like Vietnam. And something that should be mentioned about Reagan, he was famous too because he struggled with Alzheimer's disease. He died in 2004. Unfortunately, like I wouldn't want Alzheimer's disease on anybody. So, and I will just say this. Vietnam was very influential. It has an effect on American society today, but you see it starting in the 80s with Reagan. in the sense that America doesn't want to invade another country like it did in Vietnam, which was a failure, but it wants to send support and troops into other countries. So, and that's kind of been a little bit of our military today. And it's kind of what we've been doing in Ukraine. We don't want to send troops on the ground, but we'll still send military supplies and aid. And I think personally, all that feeling of we don't want to invade a country because of what happened or we might ruin it, I think that honestly stems from the Vietnam War, because we saw what happened when we invade a country that doesn't have a clear boundary between enemies and non-enemies, and that's based on idealistic battle of communism versus democracy. We saw the negative effects of such an invasion with Vietnam. So, and I think that still affects our culture and our military today. I just want to mention that. And I will say, before I go to my last slide, Reagan did have a very famous speech in Berlin at the Brandenburg Gate. And it's heavily quoted in America, especially among conservatives. A lot of conservatives and Republicans believe that Reagan was the one who kind of started the end of the Soviet Union. I personally disagree. I don't think he ended the Soviet Union. I think the Soviet Union ended itself through its own inner conflicts and problems. But this was a very famous quote and speech. And I do have to mention it, in part because it was also the first time an American president, I think, directly addressed in public a Soviet leader to act in the name of democracy. And he said this, I think, in part because Reagan was trying to encourage Gorbachev, because he knew that Gorbachev was having glasnost and perestroika, that Gorbachev was also trying to make reforms. And I think Reagan was trying to push Gorbachev even further and encourage him. And I'll just read you his speech. It's very famous, especially the last line. He says, "Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of the city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. Standing before the Brandenburg Gate, every man is a German, separated from his fellow man. Every man is a Berliner, forced to look upon a scar. As long as this gate is closed, as long as the scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So, and it was a very symbolic speech, and I think still a very important one in American history, because he's standing near the Berlin Wall, which separated. It was kind of the start of the Iron Curtain. It was one of the symbols of the Iron Curtain that separated East and West Europe. And it was separated kind of like the Soviet Union and Western nations and countries. And this was after, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So I think that's another reason why this momentum that he's seeing in Eastern Europe, especially in Berlin, he wants to carry it forward, and he wants to push Gorbachev to really freeing the Soviet Union. So I don't think he wanted to. I don't think Reagan wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, but he saw perestroika and he heard about glasnost, and I think he really wanted to encourage that. But I had to show you this quote because it is very famous. And for our last slide, I'll just conclude with the 1980s, because next topic we'll discuss the 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, as well as the beginning of the war on terror, and also U.S.-Ukrainian relations, especially under Bush, Obama, and Trump. But before we move on for that, I'll just do a little review of the 80s. So as I said, Reagan had this famous quote, "Let's make America great again." And that's it just encapsulates the optimism that many people wanted to have during the 80s. And unfortunately for the 80s, it was a time of change, but a lot of it wasn't very good in my opinion. So first of all, you have the rise of the Christian right. You have, strong Christian influences in the conservative faction in American politics. And that's not necessarily bad. It's just that they become very influential in the Republican Party to such an extent that I think they overtake the Republican Party. And I don't think that's good for any political party to have one faction of it control the whole party. I say that even as a Democrat. But anyway, this is the rise of the conservative evangelical Christian movement in America, especially in politics. This is also when you have MTV, the debut of MTV, music television, huge in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And now it's kind of gone downhill today. But it was a big deal, you had, live music, live television music. The music video was the thing to watch. You had the rise of heavy metal, especially like Iron Maiden and Metallica. You also have the rise of like a lot of pop music like George Michael and Madonna. So I think there was this strange, I think the 80s were very strange. I think you had this one moment in America where people want to be optimistic about America, but in reality, it's still not great. And part of that reality is shown through metal bands. Heavy metal bands were still very deeply angered by what they saw in 1980s America. Part of that has to do with the drugs in the 1980s. Huge amounts of drugs during the 80s and huge amounts of wealth in America in the 80s. One great example of that wealth is Donald Trump. Here he is with his wife Ivana in 1983. And she is posing, they're kind of the symbolism of wealth, of new wealth in America. But like I said, the tax cuts for the rich didn't help the middle class or poor under Reagan. They didn't. So the rich just got richer while the poor just remained poor and middle class remained middle class. And a lot of these rich folks, they were called yuppies. They stood for young urban professionals. You can kind of see what they look like here. They wanted to kind of flaunt off their wealth. They're young. They're trying to become an executive at an American company. So there was this great urge, I would say, in American culture for wealth. A lot of people are trying to make riches very quickly, very fast. There's this great optimism, especially among white wealthy Americans for wealth, because they can get it. If the American economy in the 80s is booming, and the people who are benefiting from this boom is generally white Americans, especially upper class Americans. And this is just so you know, from the movie American Psycho. It was filmed in 2000, but it's about the 1980s wealth culture. It's a psychotic movie, like it's a scary movie, it's a horror movie, but it's very well done and it stars Christian Bale. I like it. It's a good movie, but it's crazy, you know. And then something that I will lastly mention in the 80s that a lot of people don't really want to talk about, at least when they talk about Reagan, but it has to be mentioned, was the AIDS epidemic in America. So while we have this optimism, this kind of cover of optimism and wealth in America, we have still a lot of drugs. We still have the war on drugs in America. Black men and brown men are still being imprisoned for small amounts of drugs and cocaine, while rich white men are sniffing it up the wazoo. You also have the AIDS epidemic. And AIDS, I almost need to save a whole slide for this. The AIDS epidemic, kind of like the coronavirus, let me put it that way, it just hit us by surprise. It did. I think it was in like 1982 or three when they first, I think, found the first case of an AIDS patient in America, in California, I believe. And at first, the Reagan administration, and I would say for a very long time, honestly, during the AIDS outbreak in America in the 80s, the Reagan administration kind of wanted to ignore it. They didn't really want to talk about it. They didn't really want to deal with it. It was to be done in private. And part of that reason is because there's still a lot of homophobia in America in the 80s. I don't talk about the LGBTQ movement a lot in American history, but in the 80s, it really starts to rise up because there are a lot of AIDS cases among the LGBT community. Part of that is just because of our sex education isn't very good in America. Part of that is, you know, loose sexual norms at times. But part of that is also like there isn't just enough public awareness of AIDS and sexual activity, so to speak. When AIDS came out, a lot of people didn't know really where it came from or how it spread. They were freaked out that it would be spread by spit. And they called it for a very long time in the beginning the gay disease because people thought that AIDS could only be passed through gay men, which is not true at all. It's passed through anyone who shares bodily fluids with someone else. It can be passed through the needle. It can be passed through a blood transfusion. It's not just sexual activities. But that's why I think a huge reason why a lot of Americans, especially white Americans and the Reagan administration, were in denial of the AIDS epidemic because admitting you have this epidemic means that you have to treat the people who face the epidemic, people who have AIDS. And that means caring and helping people who are gay, but not just gay, people who use drugs, you know, because it was often transmitted through drug transfusions. So AIDS hit a group of the American population that a lot of Americans didn't really want to help. It primarily hit gay Americans, especially gay men American, and also drug users and people from poor neighborhoods. And there was this big campaign, especially among the gay community in America, to raise awareness of the death of AIDS among its community. They had this famous AIDS activism poster. It's from the group called Act Up. And it was a very simple poster. It said silence equals death. And it has the pink triangle because I think the pink triangle was the triangle that the Nazis put on gay men and women during the concentration camps. You were labeled. Jews had the yellow Star of David. Gay people had the pink triangle. So that's why they put the pink triangle. This idea that your silence, your desire to ignore this issue is killing us. And to be honest, this is one of the areas of Reagan administration, besides a few others, especially the enormous wealth that white wealthy Americans continued to gain during his time period. This is the other period. This is the other thing that a lot of people think that he failed on as a president. It was during the AIDS epidemic. He made it far worse, and it was more so that he allowed more deaths to happen, possibly because he didn't really want to address the issue. He felt uncomfortable by it. And to be honest, part of that is because the evangelical right, evangelical Christians, they believe that this was a homosexual disease, and some of them believe that gay people deserve this disease for their behavior, for their beliefs. So anyway, that is the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s in America, guys. Thank you so much for being patient with me. I'm going to answer questions now. But we will end in our next lecture, the final lecture. We will end the Cold War, particularly focusing on the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991, the U.S. response to that, our relations. But I will also talk about the Gulf Wars. We have the Persian Gulf War in the 90s, but we also have the Iraq War and Afghan War. We have the War on Terror, the general term for this wars in the early 2000s. And I will also mention and talk about U.S.-Ukrainian relations. I will do that. Particularly, again, as I said, under Bush, George Bush Jr., under Obama, and under Trump. And and I'll take any other questions you might have, from previous lectures too. So I want to thank you all for joining me. And our next lecture will be June 16th, which is 2 weeks from today. So let me just look at the chats, the questions. All right. All right, guys, your questions. All right. Number 1, there is an opinion that America is participating in wars in other countries in order to weaken their potential or to compete for their interests under the guise of good intentions. I do not support this opinion, but still, yeah, that's possible too. What's hard about wars and like what's hard about understanding why US is engaged in a war is because sometimes the information that you need to really understand why the US is engaged in a war is hidden. It's confidential. It's under top secret files. So we can't always say, as an American citizen or as an American public, why the US is engaged in a war, because sometimes what the US says on TV, what the president or the military leaders say on TV, is not what is actually happening, or not what they actually believe, or there's something else, but it's top secret, so we don't know. One of the examples of this is that many people think that the reason why we invaded Iraq in 2003 was not really to get rid of Saddam Hussein or supposed weapons of mass destruction, is because we wanted to obtain their oil fields. We wanted to have dominance over their oil industry, or not oil industry, but to ensure the oil kept flowing from Iraq. I don't know why. I don't really know why we invaded Iraq. Let me put it that way. And why we invaded other countries, I'm not really sure too. Some of the reasons, the ways that we can know why we did certain things in American history is once confidential documents are revealed, once top secret documents are revealed, we can get a better understanding of them. But that's a good point, you know. I don't want to say that America is perfect or that it's always good, that we always act in the best interest of other countries. Quite frankly, we sometimes just act in the best interest for our country and not another country. But not every American supports this. I don't want y'all to think that, oh, America always just wants to do what it wants to do and doesn't care about other countries. There are many Americans who don't agree with that position, who don't like it, who don't want it as part of our foreign policy, so to speak. So, all right, number two, thanks for the history of feminism. It was very interesting. By the way, I heard that in America there's the so-called pink tax. Products for women are more expensive than similar products for men. Yes, you are 100% correct. I have heard this many times. For some reason, if you buy a razor, a razor that's publicized for women to shave like their legs, whatever, underarms, it's higher. It costs more than a razor for a man. It's the same thing, and it's actually by the same company usually. So it is true. There is a lot of sexism in our country still, both hidden and not hidden. And that's what really makes it hard to fight sexism now in our country, I would say, is that I think a lot of sexism in America is hidden. A good example, I hate to say, is Joe Biden. So there's been this scandal against Joe Biden, who is our Democratic presidential nominee. He's going to be the individual that is going to run against Trump in November. There is this scandal about a woman named Tara Reid, who, oddly enough, for some reason, really likes Putin. Don't know why. But anyway, in the 1990s, she claims that Joe Biden like sexually touched her, or he groped her. He touched her in inappropriate ways and tried to push himself onto her, but no one was there. And then she claims too that she complained to the Joe Biden office, like to his boss or to the secretary, but they ignored her. Newspapers and even Joe Biden's presidential team have investigated this accusation. They can't find her complaints. And this is just an example of how we don't really know what happened. We don't know if Joe Biden actually did this or if it's just a made up story by Tara Reid. We don't know because it was hidden. No one else was there. So how can you prove it? It's his word against hers and vice versa. Like, it's just, and we don't really know if it happened. I have no idea if it happened. However, I wish she didn't like Putin so much. There has been revelations that she's like admires Putin. She's written posts about him on her Facebook. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The whole point is there's a scandal against Joe Biden, and we don't know if it happened or didn't happen because no one was there. It was hidden. Thanks for the lecture. I know about the protests in America that are taking place now, the Black Lives Matter against police violence. How is the government going to deal with this? Oh my God, that's a great question. With all due respect, in terms of the federal government, I don't think they're dealing with it very well. In fact, it's been a big, I would say, controversy and I don't even know if it's controversy, but it's been a great area of disappointment among many Americans the way the Trump administration is responding to these protests. So Trump has said that he feels really bad about what happens with George Floyd. He is an ally to George Floyd in the protests, but he is standing with law and order. And he thinks that the best way to stop this violence, this protest and this violence, is to bring in as much military and police power as you can and to take down the protesters. So basically, he is saying that to fight violence, you need violence, which I personally do not agree with at all. He's not, in my opinion, he's taken the wrong position in that instead of really sympathizing with the protesters and really trying to help, fight police brutality against Black Americans, he's just making the police more brutal at times. Like he's encouraging police officers and police departments to attack and to really go after the protesters. Yesterday, he wanted to have a photo opportunity in front of a church where he held a Bible, but there were protesters in the way. So he ordered the police, the military police, to spray tear gas in front of the protesters so that they would move. And like, that's not how you lead a country, with all due respect. That is not how you do that. Just so you can get a photo op, so you can hold a Bible. And let's be all frank here, Trump is not a Christian. I mean, he claims to be, but he certainly hasn't acted as one. He's just doing this because so many people who vote for him are Christians, and they are actual Christians, like they believe in it genuinely. But I don't think he does. But anyway, and in terms of the state governments, the states are having a hard time dealing with this. Some are letting their local police departments just deal with the protesters in their own way. Some are bringing in the National Guard. The National Guard is a military unit. It's an army unit that is controlled and funded by the state governments, and every state has one. And so the states are bringing in their military units to help the police, to back up the police against the protesters. And I will say, there are some police departments that are being empathetic to these protesters. They are being kind, I would say. They're not being mean. But then there are some that are being even more violent, that are hitting and pushing protesters unlawfully. They're spraying pepper spray and tear gas on very peaceful protests. So I don't know how this protest is all going to happen. I don't know how it's going to end. And what's really frustrating for me as an American and someone who loves history is that this is happening every decade in America. I know I didn't cover it in every decade in America, but this is not just something that is happening now, that happened with Trayvon Martin in 2014. This happened in the 90s. This happened in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s. Like, the violence against Black people among police is an is an issue that keeps coming up in America every decade, and we can't seem to create a solution. And part of that reason, I will just say, why the solution is so difficult is because what you have to do is fight racism in America. And racism in America goes back to the founding in America. How do you undo something that is absolutely integral to our country? I don't know how. I don't know how you fight it. How do you fight a history that is over, like 300 years old of racism? I don't know. Like, I don't have an answer for that. A lot of other countries, they did have slavery, like England, but England wasn't founded on slavery, so to speak. It was founded on the conquest of the Normans, I believe, in the early 10th century, I think. I don't know British history very well. But what I'm trying to say is, like, what makes America unique, in my opinion, and for worse, unique in a bad way, is that our country, I really believe this is true. Our country was founded on freedom, but that freedom was founded because we had slavery. We cannot articulate or fight for freedom if we don't know what it looks like when you don't have freedom. And I believe because we had slavery, we have racism in our country, but also it's what's ironically made us fight for freedoms. Yeah, I know that's a complicated answer, but we have an understanding of freedom because we had slavery. How can you understand something if you don't know what the opposite is? We know what freedom and independence is because we know what it looks like to not have freedom. And it's staring us in the face and it's a slave. So we understand freedom because we understand what slavery is because it's right there. So you cannot understand you can't understand slavery without freedom, and you can't understand freedom without slavery. And those are vital to the American history and American culture and American, I would say, American idealism. We love freedom, but we don't understand freedom without slavery. So, all right. I love your lecture because you do not hide the mistakes of the state. Okay. Yeah. And I want to just make this clear. I'm not trying to diss on America. Like, oh my God, America sucks. We should burn to the ground. No way. But I will just say this: when I was growing up and having American history classes, when I took American history classes in high school and in college, not even more so in college, but really in high school and middle school when I was younger, I got this nice history, this great feeling. Oh wow, we've had some ups and downs, but generally we're a great country. We've done great things. And to an extent that's true, but when I went to college, I learned how that's kind of a lie. Yes, America has done great things. We've done positive things. We have good people in this country, but we've also done some ugly things. And I don't, and when I learned about those ugly things, I was very angry that no one ever told them to me when I was younger, that it was hidden from me. And it wasn't hidden maliciously. Like my parents weren't trying to not talk about these histories. Part of it is that they didn't know how to talk about these histories. How do you talk about the Vietnam War? It's a very sore point in America. But when I learned about it, I was very happy. Not because, oh, now I know America is not great. It's more, now I know the truth. Because the truth is never happy, but the truth is never always sad. The truth is always good, bad, and ugly. You need the whole history. And why I like to learn the history of everything in America is because I want to understand why things are happening in America today. And they're happening because of what's happened in the past, even if part of that past has been hidden from us. So, okay. Tricky Dick maybe was also involved in some romantic affairs. That's one of the reasons of that nickname. I have no idea actually about Nixon's affairs. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised. It seems like every American president has had affairs in the past, especially. I don't think Obama has, or George Bush, or even Reagan. But I know obviously Bill Clinton had affairs. I even heard Eisenhower had affairs, JFK had affairs, maybe Lyndon Johnson, maybe Nixon. So, yeah, that's what happens when you have power. You can get away with things. So, all right, everyone. Thank you for joining me, and we'll have a great 7th lecture or last lecture. And I look forward to seeing you then. Have a great week, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.